Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CFO Leadership Forum, FP&A Strategies for Success. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed keynote speaker. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Madhuri Raju, co-founder and partner, International Sourcing Solutions, LLC. We are excited to have Madhuri for her keynote presentation titled Future of FP&A, Successfully Managing Cash Flow and Liquidity Needs. Welcome, Madhuri. Over to you.
Thanks, Nick, for your invitation and warm welcome to this session. So thanks for all of you to be here, taking time from your busy schedules, I'm sure. And I will promise to make it worth your time today. Today, I will be walking you through the topic of supply chain optimization as it relates to better cash flow outcomes for your company. I am Madhuri Raju. I'm the partner for International Sourcing Solutions, LLC. I'll call it ISS LLC. And next slide, please. Thank you. Since its inception in 2006, ISS LLC we've served various companies in manufacturing, education, healthcare, and technology sectors, with the particular expertise in engineering, marketing, operations, risk management, and supply chain. Next slide, please. So I just want to start by connecting the dots. It's always good to start from the basics. How is supply chain optimization connected to cash flow, right? Let's dive right in. We all know that the operating cash flow is an indicator of the health of the company, specifically its ability to pay its bills, right? That's nothing new to us. And mathematically, it's net income plus non-cash expenses minus taxes, minus changes in working capital, right? And those letters that are highlighted on the right side are what we understand to have supply chain impact, embedded in them. So the highlighted text to your right side has net income next. Net income has implied cost of goods sold, right? So which is COGS, and that within itself has operating expenses. As you can see, there could be many operating expenses, and within those embedded within those expenses, you will see inventory as one, right? So there's always the cost pressures to keep the supply chain costs under control through these expenses. Next. You will see that inventory, storage, transportation, and delivery costs are tucked under this label. So that's one of the key input that you have to the cash flow, and therefore supply chain is plays a very critical role in making sure that our net income is impacted or enhanced, not impacted in the negative way. Next. So the other thing is we have changes in working capital. What do we have underneath? We have inventory levels, receivables, and payables, right? So these are very commonly understood terms, and we have the storage costs, we have the transportation delivery costs. These costs need to be measured and managed as well. Changes in working capital also needs monitoring, intervention, and action. In order to enable the swift processing of transaction, we look for system-backed capabilities in companies with efficient processes and basically transaction-enabled systems. Inventory, of course, is the crux of all supply chain issues and should always be measured and monitored, and of course controlled. Taxes, which is the other part that wasn't highlighted in the equation. It's not much talked about much, but it's an important facet of supply chain costs, and you will see why as I go through my slides. A lot of the reason why taxes are not directly a function of supply chain actions are because it is a collaborative, it comes as an output of a collaboration between supply chain and finance. And that collaboration enables us to have the visibility on taxes, which then flows our entire costs that supply chain incurs into our cash flow, operating cash flow. So we have a visibility of what our supply chain is costing us end to end to our cash flow. Next slide. So now for some audience participation, I think you've already been asked a question. What industry, I'd love to hear what industries are represented here in the audience. So I'd like to see, if there is, Lindsay is collecting your responses and she's giving me, a summary. Let me see. There is manufacturing and there is education among, and that's great. Do I read it right that I have some healthcare? Oh yes, manufacturing, education, healthcare, IT, hospitality, financial services. I think that spans the gamut of the industry today, and you will see there's a lot of things I will talk about in terms of the supply chain impacts that you might be feeling in your industry, which is unique to you. Next slide, please. So let me ask you, are there any top supply chain driven cash flow risks that you're observing in your areas? And I will give Lindsay Smith a minute to consolidate the answers and give me sort of like a snapshot. So it does look like, and this is not surprising, inventory, 41% of you say that inventory is your main risk, with 19% of you saying transportation and logistics is your risk. 30% say it's receivables, 7% say it's taxes. And fair enough, 4% of you say you're not sure, whether it is because you don't have visibility or because you don't have a system by which you can track these. I'm not sure what the reason is, but I'm assuming that you probably don't have the visibility. I'll be a little bit optimistic here. Next slide, please. So now let's take a dive into the supply chain related risk categories you just polled in the previous slide and look at some of the trends affecting those key categories. And I'm sure some of these trends are affecting or impacting you as we speak. I'm not surprised to see 41% of you across these different industries are experiencing inventory related risks in your supply chain, right? Why do we see that? It's definitely economic uncertainty is causing this huge inventory surge. We are coming out of the pandemic, and the manufacturers were trying to alleviate supply chain hiccups before the pandemic and while the pandemic was ongoing, by getting away from just in time and protecting the supply or protecting the inventory, or by having more inventory so that the customers are served, right? So this bloated inventory during the pandemic did not just go away. Now inflation is causing the manufacturers to hoard more inventory, and that is showing up in your optimal inventory, in your minimum stock, in your safety stock. These levels have all gone up because you're trying to stock that inventory in order to serve your customers, no matter which industry you are in, right? So this is definitely putting a damper on your cash flow, because the more inventory you have, the less cash flow you're seeing that you can use towards other areas in your business. So until an economic equilibrium is reached, cash flow volatility will be expected. Is to be expected, and there's nothing one can do about this. But I think the key thing will be to measure your inventory and right size it. So having the tools to properly calibrate your inventory levels and determine what they should be based on either AI ML guided algorithms if you have it, if not guided by what the baseline should be, and with the view of developing that long range AI ML, because this is not the only time you're going to see that. You're going to see that coming further down. But I'm going to reserve those for a later slide. But the next thing here I'm seeing that is impacting the inventory is the geopolitical uncertainty, which has been a constant worry after COVID, right? And now it's taken on a nosedive with physical wars and cold wars. As a result, some industries are seeing more blips than the others. Energy and grain prices have gone up. Industrial metal prices, on the other end, are seeing a little bit of a decline, mostly because of the cooling world economy. Right? We don't want to see that cooling, but unfortunately, there is some of that happening, and because of that, there's that mixed, cost impact that we are seeing in these different commodities. Next slide, please. Next, we have transportation and logistics. I think I have a bit of a good news to share here. Even though some of you may be thinking that you're having a risk here, what I'm seeing is the cost related to this driver should have actually come down, because some of the energy prices are actually, compared to 2 years ago, right? Definitely they're up, but they are trending downwards. So I would say that nearshoring of those suppliers, because of the pandemic, right? A lot of the manufacturers during the pandemic started nearshoring the suppliers, and that brought down the transportation cost. And energy prices are trending downward from a year ago, which is good news. That is also showing up as a reduced transportation cost. On top of it, better optimization, right, in the logistics ecosystem. The complexity of the ecosystem is also being simplified by mergers and acquisitions in that space, right? So we are looking at a better picture for logistics and transportation. A question here has come up. Forecasting has always been an issue. Have you seen improvements in a forecast methodology that is reliable? The answer to that question lies in your framework to assess these risks, right? A lot of us, we need to assess these risks using a framework that is unique to our company. And in that framework, you will have certain weightages given to some drivers. And those drivers need to be then assessed and measured and monitored, right? And when you do that, you will be able to then say, hey, if you do have a driver, let's say with transportation, you have the near shoring, right, of your suppliers, and then you have your optimization of, or the logistics companies M&A as a factor. Which one is impacting you more, right? And then if nearshoring is probably giving you more of an impact than the other, then you'd have an appropriate weightage. You'd measure the impact month after month, quarter after quarter, and that's going to give you an intelligence to then look forward. Forecasting is it's a learned skill. I don't think one can just be a better forecaster right off the bat, looking at the industry. It's somewhat of a AI ML function, and that's something one has to develop in house using better analytics. I know I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to have that on a later slide, but that's just a short answer for you right now. I'll give you a better answer when we get to the slide. Um, do you have a go-to in improving logistics? Yes, there are some systems and analytic systems that you can have in your companies that can perhaps track, monitor, and better address some of the risks you're seeing, if that's what you're asking. So you can definitely develop a framework. There are templates that others provide. Uh, there are some services companies that provide the template, and you can definitely sort of custom tailor it to your company. Uh, but that's again something that you need to evolve as you go along. So, how does leasing assist in managing cash flow for asset purchases? What are the factors in deciding? I think the question is chopped off, but I will keep that in my parking lot. I will address as we go along. Next slide, please. Next, on the receivable side, though, the businesses, as we see, are facing uncertain post-pandemic future due to the economic concerns we talked about, right? Inflation, recession, all these things. So the supplier selection is going to become a little bit tricky, and they will need to be selected with credit quality as an important factor to consider while you're selecting your suppliers. So I think you should have in your framework to monitor and to regularly assess your supplier credit quality so that you're not exposing yourself to a receivable, right, that you don't that you have to write off. So that's going to have a direct impact to your cash flow. So next slide, please. A question has just come in. How do you factor in changes in pricing due to supply chain delays? Well, supply usually, when you have changes in pricing in the delay, it usually surfaces itself in the shipping cost. It's a transportation cost, because at the end of the day, when most companies have to pay premium pricing to make sure that they have that material or the part in place in order for their production to go on, so that their production schedule is kept, because that everybody wants to keep their schedule on time, right? So some companies, or most companies, end up spending more money to make sure that the commodity or part is in place. So that's how that's factored in, if I answered that question. So let's move on to taxes. This, fortunately or unfortunately, is not on top of a typical supply chain professional's mind, right? It's more of a finance consideration. Hence, there needs to be a collaboration between finance and supply chain to consider the geography of the inventory footprint. As you can see, right, not all states in the US, for example, handles taxation on inventory the same way. In some states, the taxes are, it's fully taxed. In some states that are orange, they're partially taxed. And in some states, they're no tax. So you got to consider your inventory footprint before you make such decisions, right? So, or you have such impacts. Again, also, it also depends on the types of accounting methods used. IFRS, which is used by the international, companies, it does not allow LIFO, last in, first out. And last in, first out typically has a better outcome in, situations where we have inflation. And normally companies, following GAAP methodology, consider FIFO, first in, first out. So that's what, these are things that need to be considered, and it's important that the supply chain partners work with the finance uh, folks in order to keep this at bay. Next slide, please. So how do we then, I mean, I've gone through all the different factors that we have, we need to consider, or the high risk factors. How do we then, move forward from here? There have been questions around, how do I factor in my logistics cost? How do I factor in my lease versus buy, right? How do I, um, how do I forecast? So first of all, we need to have a framework. So do we need to reassess? So if you don't have a framework, and I'd be surprised, all companies have a framework that they measure and monitor to. Do you have to reassess? The first question you have to ask yourself is, do you need to reassess your strategy based on the framework, right? Based on the current geopolitics, current economic climate, do you have to do anything different? Do you have to look at the different footprints for your inventory? Because inventory has such a big part to play in supply chain and in your cost flow model, cash flow model. Do you need to reconfigure it? Now, how are your partnerships working, right? Do some of your geopolitical, um, you know, uh, pieces, but as they're moving, are your partnerships going to be affected by it? Do we need to move those puzzle pieces, right? KPMG said it very well, and I thought instead of writing text, I borrowed their text. They said it very well when they said these are the things that we need to consider to sort of reassess where we stand, uh, with our supply chain related risks. Next slide, please. So at the, I don't want this to sound like I'm trying to sell technology at the end of the game and simplifying your problems. There's a lot of problems one needs to simplify. But at the core of everything, with all these questions being asked, right? What support and training do you give a non-finance members so they don't misinterpret data, right? Or how do you get all the non-finance stakeholders to supply the necessary data for proper cash flow projecting? The answer lies in proper visibility of the data. So that in turn translates to investing in technology to grow and transform your internal processes and your methodologies. So in order to have the visibility across the different disciplines, whether it's finance, it's marketing, it's supply chain, making sure they're all seeing the same source of data or a single source of truth, it is important that that happens so that we can stay ahead of risks and plan mitigations together collectively in a multifunctional format. And to that end, I would say the companies need to look at accelerating their digitalization journeys. Digitization already started. Digitalization is to, sort of make it, get prescriptive models, more forecasting, more prediction, more prescription in your methodology internally that you employ, so that you can map, monitor end-to-end value stream and properly resolve any issues that you see within your value stream on time, right? We don't need to wait. In the old ways of doing things on paper, you don't want to wait for a paper-based system for a whole month or two before you actually can address a problem that occurred a month or two ago. A real-time access to data results in timely resolution of the problem. So with that, I know I have addressed, the next slide, please. I have addressed a lot of questions. Thank you for being here. And I don't know if I have any more time for questions. I've answered some, but if you have any last question, I'm willing to take it as well. how does a successful contingency plan look like, especially during trying times? I think a contingency plan should be very actionable based on the framework of, that you're monitoring the risks and planning the actions for those risks. I think those should all sort of be traceable end to end. To me, that is successful, right? You can't have an action that is not traceable to a high risk. So for me, the traceability is important. How do you deal with any of the tax implications on inventory for, I don't know what OUS means, but I would say talk to your finance partners and the tax team there would have a wealth of knowledge. Um, how are the finance teams harnessing the power of scenario planning to make better predictions? There are a gamut of things the finance teams are doing. I've been part of game theories. I've actually participated in game theories in big companies where scenario planning is done with all the stakeholders in the room on the table, making polling together their options and making plans based on all the stakeholders present at the table. And I've been with, game theory is more proactive. A reactive approach is, if you have an earthquake, you have an inventory problem, how do you fix it, right? So I've been in both a proactive and a reactive situation. Depends on the situation at hand. So I think a lot of this has to play out based on what you have going on. Thank you. I think I'm going to end it now. Thank you. Thank you, Argyle, for giving me yet another chance to come talk to all of you. You've been a wonderful audience, and the questions have been very insightful. And thank you, and you have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you, Majuri, for such an insightful presentation. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic keynote. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thanks so much.